I'll be reading two pieces tonight, and also thank you to all of you for having me here as part of the Big Rock reading series. It's really a pleasure, and it's great to see so many people out to come and listen to stories, and there's so many other things you can do for your time. Speaking of stories, I'll be reading you two tonight. The first is a short story. The second will be a piece from my novel. So the first story that I'll be reading is called Transitory Cities. I wrote this 10 years ago while I was at an artist colony in Brazil. And one of my fellow artists who was there was a Cuban artist, wonderful artist, visual artist called Carlos Esteves. And we used to joke around a lot. You meet in the dining room, you talk about things. And one day, apparently, we had, I don't even remember this, but he reminded me of it, but we had a running joke about a snail that took about 3 hours to cross a deck while I was reading a very long book. And he had joked a lot also about the city nearest us, which was the city of Salvador in northeast Brazil, which also has a slightly sleepy, slow feel. He made a drawing out of this conversation, which he called, in Spanish, Ciudades Transitorias, and it showed skeletal figures. It's a line drawing of skeletal figures bearing huge buildings on their backs. So it was a city composed of these figures carrying the buildings from one place to another. On our last days at the colony, he gave me a little detail from this drawing as my parting gift, and I, as a thank you to him, wrote a story based on that image. So this is the image I'd like you to have in mind as I read you the story, which I call Transitory Cities. Everybody can hear me all right? Okay. How did he come to bear others' homes on his back? That question can only be answered by the one holding the strings, ascending from Pram's pivotal points, as from the joints of every bearer. It's not that Pram didn't like bearing the building. He did. He received no acknowledgement, at least not from the tenants. He wouldn't have wanted the residents of the building he bore to know that he chose where they would be when they walked out the front door of their apartment building in the morning. Briefcase or toolkit or purse or newspaper in one hand, brown paper lunch bag in the other, ready to participate in maintaining the universe, their first task that of finding their way to the office or factory, which could be anywhere within their city. They would get to the end of the front walk, where Pram could see them, and look around, trying to get their bearings. The portly, sallow man in 2A, brushing cat hairs off his wide lapels. He always thought he was late and would explode in frustration, his upper lip curling out and in, out and in. The tall, timid woman in 2B, whose suit, shoes, hat, and purse were all cheap and all matched. She was new to her job, and her boss had made it clear he found her attractive, which both scared her and reassured her of the possibilities for advancement. As she left the apartment building, she would look distressed, but was secretly glad to have the task between home and work of trying to determine where to go. If she had to sit on the same train every day, she would get sick from anticipation. A single mother in 2C, with one child to take to school and the other to her mother's, the young mother thought she had found a way to hasten the process of homing in on their destinations. The older child proudly carried his mother's welding mask and was excited because every morning was an adventure. The younger child looked sleepy. Pram laughed quietly at their problems. Sometimes he followed one of them to see how long it took and what method, if any, the tenant used. Once in a while, he caught sight of one of his tenants still searching hours later, unable to find his or her workplace. If he liked that tenant, Pram would sail ahead to put the apartment building in her path, so at least she could go home, call in sick, enjoy the rest of the day as a truant watching daytime television, going through old photographs, playing air guitar. If he didn't like the tenant, he would just continue following, laughing, at a distance, until the workday was over and the tenant gave up and returned home. The bearers daily chose a destination where they would go that night after all tenants were in. They would remain fixed there for a few hours in the morning and evening of the next day, which system permitted tenants to find their way home in the evenings, almost without exception. During the day, in the process of choosing, there were charts the bearers could consult. Lists of zoning rules, maps, development plans, treatises on sewage disposal and transit management, official and unofficial histories of the city, biographies detailing the lives and contributions of its most eccentric and wealthiest residents, all meant to instruct and inspire. Pram used these materials desultorily, thinking it sufficient that so many of his kind were so apparently conscientious about their choices. There was always a queue for the best materials. The few who made it to the front of the lines probably decreased the degree of chance in their choices, he thought, as he sailed past them. All the others must have been there to impress. The bearers were not allowed to be stationary for more than those few required hours, morning and evening, and in any case it was uncomfortable for them to be in the same position any longer. Theoretically, they could return to the same spot for as long as they wanted, but in fact there was rarely any advantage in that beyond a few days, and so they continually searched and researched, formed and reformed. The strings ascending from their bodies implied that they were subject to some governing force, but they behaved as though they had full power of choice over their actions, as long as they complied with certain known rules. Brown never paid for a stopping spot, though he negotiated and, at times, bullied. He had also been bullied, but generally preferred to move on than to tangle. There were always places nearly as good, sometimes better. He chose, depending on whether he was in the mood for his building to be an act of gentrification in a decrepit neighborhood, the single residential space in an industrial zone, the last modest walk-up in the heart of the commercial center, a set of breezy beachside condos, or just another suburban cinder block, indistinguishable from hundreds stretching to all sides of it, between publicly manicured lawns and scrawny trees with fences around them to keep the dogs out. He imagined, sometimes overheard, his tenants' preferences. The sagging divorcee in 3A who made an effort to flirt with the man in 2A. Her husband had departed with the children 5 years ago, and she rarely left the apartment, except to get sleeping pills and attend Jane Austen fan club meetings. She had her groceries delivered, but if they didn't arrive in time, or didn't arrive, she went out to buy cigarettes. When the building was situated on a beach or park, she went out carrying a book, wearing a hat with a long chiffon scarf, and took advantage. The two university students in 3B, roommates who had sex with one another at night, though they didn't speak of this to each other or anyone else. When the building was near the campus, one or the other might come home for lunch, and other students drop in later to drink beer and listen to albums. When it was otherwise situated, they were more studious. 3C was empty, but wouldn't be hard to fill. Once, Brown came upon an avenue of newly restored historic buildings, including the homes of the city's two greatest 19th century writers, the home of the progressive judge who dismantled the factory towns on which the city's three largest family fortunes had been built, the courthouse, where that judge presided, now a museum, and the headquarters of the shipping company that started and finished the building boom at the port. The avenue lasted in various compositions for nearly 3 days, and Brown lingered there throughout, admiring the plasterwork, the bas-reliefs, eavesdropping on tourists and guides. The avenue was still talked about by anyone who saw it. Brown was a bit disappointed that none of the tenants in his building had the time or inclination to take advantage. It was in those days that he first saw Pela. She bore a building similar to his in size, but in contrast to his stucco facade, hers was of red brick and better maintained. She kept to the avenue's end, he noticed, and looked like she, too, was interested in the lessons of the past it so briefly made available. Brown was unambitious, and had always been glad he bore a residential and not a business building, but he was mildly envious of bearers whose buildings had architectural or historical significance. The next time he saw Pela, she was hovering uncertainly near the queues for recent updates on property tax and quarantine regulations. He saw her give up and depart. They sometimes crossed paths in front of the television station, where they glanced at the headlines, LED parade across the smoked glass vitrine. He always waited for the sports highlights, but noticed she took particular interest in reports of violent crimes, and that she glazed over a little, as he did, at the governor's regular statements in support of the nation's going to war, a possibility which seemed remote and unlikely, despite the politicians' repetitious alarm. Finally, they made eye contact. It was during a very interesting few hours when the ancient trading post was situated on its probable original site. The A-frame building had been reconstructed from a few beams and stones. Archaeological fragments were displayed within, along cheesy, half-life-size dioramas demonstrating the uses of ancient tools. After that, she started looking out for him too. At first, they would simply slow if their trajectories coincided. After several such acknowledgments, it began to happen that one would curve toward the other. Then each began to curve more to approximate the other's direction, so that eventually they were traveling short distances together, but without abandoning their original destinations. Increasingly, though, their destinations became the same. There may have been rules against this, but it was not something they planned or agreed upon even, or even for some time acknowledged. They made no effort to find out about the governing regulations. Their behavior may even have been sanctioned. She didn't have his mischievous attitude toward the tenants of the building she bore. She seemed at once more detached and more anxious. If a tenant had a big day at work or other pressures, she would choose destinations to accommodate, as well as choosing others to enrich. Unlike Cram, she would never tail any tenant for the sake of mere interest, and since his stance was essentially capricious, he was more often content to accept her choices of routes and destinations than she was to follow him. It still happened that some idea or place would catch his fancy, then she would eventually join him, or he eventually rejoin her. It was thus their buildings became neighbors. A solid, decent-looking man in Pela's building habitually left for work at just the same time as the single mother. He always helped her carry things to her car and was eventually invited for dinner. Cram's 3C filled with a tenant who moved out of Pela's 4B. The two university students found out there were 3 more of their number next door. The sallow man in 2A developed a boundary dispute with a widowed seamstress involving their cats. There was an Independence Day party with lawn chairs and another party when the city's football team won the national medallion. The change in the residents' lives was significant, but not radical or puzzling. By contrast, the bearers' existences changed fundamentally. Cram wondered if the routine and expectations amounted to some feeling akin to having a home. The city was in a phase of intense self-regard and reevaluation. Its residents were therefore taken aback when they learned that the long, imminent war had already begun. Demonstrators for every side hastily appeared in the streets, trying to find those of their own or a comparable political ilk, trying to find the appropriate government building in front of which they needed to convene. This was much more difficult than it had been because, without informing the city's residents, the government had committed to keeping all significant buildings moving fast and mostly toward the periphery to diminish their vulnerability to bombs. Low-flying planes menaced the city at odd hours. Rumors floated that these planes were seeking to destroy the city's 2 tallest and most important commercial buildings, which had not been sighted for weeks. Citizens began to grumble. The economy was grinding to a halt, with workers in banking and trade nearly unable to attend their jobs. What was the point, they said, in protecting the buildings if they were empty? But others said there was symbolic value in keeping the city physically intact, and since the war was largely symbolic, the objectors silenced themselves. Or such at least is what the citizens deduced the government had resolved. When confronted, officials confirmed this. In point of fact, practically none of the city's residents had any control over the movements of their buildings or knowledge of the mechanisms by which they moved. Priests and politicians both claimed access to the means of control, and citizens made themselves beholden with petitions to these intermediaries, even while their bearers were listening to find out what the residents believed and wanted. The bearers listened at forums like public meetings and informal gathering sites like coffee houses. They tried also, when they could, to overhear secret desires, expressed only in dining rooms, confessionals. It's unclear how much control even the bearers had over their movements, but they had enough to want to act in the citizens' interests. It was clear in this time that cooperating in the citywide shell game would be best for all concerned. Cram wondered what it would be like to bear one of those now empty buildings. He thought he would feel dull and self-important. Besides which, a bearer charged with such a responsibility would have to travel alone. In his building, the divorcee surprisingly had sprung into action, along with one of the university students and the single mother who might have been the most politically committed but had the least time to offer the movement. Graham was keen to keep abreast of the city's position and the citizens' reaction. He would regularly cross the corner of the famous park where soapbox orators came to speak and glide close by press scrums to catch unmediated comments before they hit the news. He once nearly caught up with a munitions factory, though the windows were shaded with a reflective coating. It was quickly evident that Pela acted on an opposite impulse to his. If any individual in her building desired to get involved, she would facilitate the involvement. Otherwise, she kept to the quietest zones, whether due to some opinion of her own or to protect those residents who wanted to maintain a facade of normalcy. She and Graham started increasingly to drift apart. I live in apartment 4, the only apartment on the top floor of the building Cram bears. For years, I dealt with the frustrations of commuting, which are considerable in any large city, and especially so when one is in no fixed address, one's workplace constantly on the move. I worked to others' schedules, fulfilling demands I saw as pointless until finally I succeeded in becoming self-employed. Graham thinks no one in the building, no city resident for that matter, sees him or knows what he does. And this is true of my neighbors, whose lives are full of real things and real concerns, as mine once was. Now, with all my attention trained on the ephemeral and the virtual, I began quite naturally to perceive him and then to watch him as I spent large portions of my day standing and looking out my window. I've recounted the above based on these observations, during the course of which I also gave Ram and Hela names of my own choosing. I don't know if they have names. If they speak, I cannot hear them, although maybe I could develop that ability too with time and diligence. The stories of my co-tenants are based on gossip. I did not observe the bomb hitting Hela's building. She would have been in some residential zone while our building was near a military base on the outskirts. I remember watching the soldiers frog marching one another into simulated shanty-style prison camps. I read later that the bombers were probably expected to hit the Aerial and Naval Defense Headquarters, whose route had been leaked to the press. But of course the route was changed when the leak was discovered, and instead the bombs splattered an unfashionable and waning shopping mall, an amusement fair of the kind that sets up in small towns and suburbs 1 week a year, and a few middle-income apartment buildings, including Hela's. The destruction was thorough, and the city's residents shocked. She looked very light as she approached, her back bare but for shards of the foundation and rubble, chunks of which rolled off from time to time with her movements. Also, half of one of the bushes that had stood by the front door bizarrely remained erect, but one side of it burned off, the other scarred but recognizable. She moved slowly, and when she was close, she reached out to touch Fran's shoulder with her hand and then put her forehead to his. The residents of our building, the ones who were at home when she arrived and the ones who came home later, saw what had happened to her building. They were dismayed and panicked. They looked for news. They tried to console the single mother who had tried without success not to get her hopes up about the gentle, steadily employed man. She was crushed, but pulled herself together for the sake of the children. The divorcee proved her mettle, and even motivated the awkward young office worker who made lasagnas and oatmeal cookies we consumed together in front of the television. Below us, the bearers made love, although I don't know if this is what they consider it or call it. At first, their parts meeting made a clacking noise, sometimes more like plastic, sometimes like wood, sometimes even chiming like ceramic or clashing like wires. The lines ascending from their limbs crossed and uncrossed, crossed and uncrossed. This continued for 2, no, I think it was 3 days, while the noise grew softer and softer until there was no sound at all. Sometimes they would be still, embracing, sometimes move vigorously. Then Hela was pulled away. She was firmly tugged until their parts disentangled, then swiftly removed as if drawn by those strings, not up, but away. Though she was moving in a very long arc, she might eventually have ascended. We haven't seen her since. Who holds the strings? I can't see that far up, but I know Ram was made for this work, as Hela was, and as each of us is made for some task, some work, even if almost none of us finds it, that task we are meant for, just as almost none of us finds perfect love. Let's translate. And now, if you'll permit me, we shake out their cell phones, wanting to chime. I'll read you a story that stands on its own from my novel. The novel, as Sandy mentioned, was based on stories that my grandmother told me about her grandmother. And when people ask me, is it made up? Is it, how much of this comes from your family history? I tend to say that on every page I can see something my grandma told me, something I found in research, and something that I just took from my imagination. It's a blend, but at this point it's pretty much, unentangleable. Is that a word? Untangleable? Unentangled? So the bit that I'm going to read to you takes place around the middle of the book, and so let me give you some background. Sibakami, who's the protagonist, the one based on my grandmother's grandmother, is married at the beginning of the book at the age of 10. She goes to live with her husband when she comes of age, at the age of 14. And at the age of 18, according to and all this is in the first 30 pages, so there's some spoilers, he dies, according to a prediction that he himself made based on his horoscopes, and he decided to get married despite it. So she's widowed with 2 small children. The thing is, in this time and place, which is the early 20th century in Southeast India, an area now called Tamil Nadu, a woman of this caste, who's Brahmin, if she is widowed, can no longer wear colors. She can only wear white, and she cannot be touched from dawn till dusk, even by her small children. Okay, so, and her children are like 2 and 4. Her little boy, she can't even hold her little boy during the day. Okay, so she takes her bath in the morning, she says her prayers, and then she removes herself. She maintains this physical purity and supposedly spiritual purity as well during the day. It's also about containing her. When she's 18, she's beautiful, and she has to be kept inside the house, basically, because otherwise she can't get out. So Sivakami's husband, though, because he had predicted his death, he hired, before he died, a servant by the name of Muchami, who, because of his caste, basically can't enter the house, just as Sivakami, because of her caste, can't leave it. But the two of them collude over 60 years to raise these children and their grandchildren eventually. Muchami is gay. That's his secret, that he doesn't bring back into the house. And so in this story, you're going to see both of them. The other people that you need to know about are Vaidam, who is her son, now grown, and Minister and Murthy, who are neighbors of theirs. I think that's all you need to know. So this story is the barber lover. Oh, the other thing I don't think I mentioned is the widow also has her head shaved. At a certain point, shortly after her widow-making, a barber comes to her in the dead of night in the courtyard. She'll be waiting, and he shaves her head. So she meets a man at night from one of the lowest castes and has her head shaved. And we see this early in the book, and now his son is helping out in the family business. So again, Sivakami is our protagonist, Muchami is her servant. Some unwelcome but not unexpected information reaches Muchami via his regular channels. He had, a week or 10 days earlier, put a word out requesting information after having seen something that didn't look quite right. He doesn't go out every night as he did when he was younger, but does still make his way through the woods and fields twice or 3 times a week in search of other men like him who need physical satisfactions they cannot give or receive in their marriages. It happens that he sees things on these journeys. Some things he understands immediately, some he must work to interpret. The only people abroad at night are those, like Muchami, it could be argued, who have no choice. One of those who must be out is the barber who clips the heads of Brahmin widows, a work of shame and sorrow done in the dark hour, favored by demons. Sivakami has her head shaved monthly, usually by the same barber who sheared her curls in the days of her widow-making and left her light-headed under the moonlight. Now, occasionally, it is his second son who comes. The first son used to come until his family decided he, meaning all of them, would be better off if he used his skill with a blade to get latex out of trees in Malayan plantations. So it happened one night that Muchami was returning home and saw the barber's second son entering the rear courtyard of a Brahmin quarter widow. He didn't think it strange until, some 10 days later, he saw the same thing again. It was then that he mentioned it to some cohorts who have now confirmed for him that the barber's second son, Padupan, has been coming and going from the house of the widow Shantam 4 or 5 nights each week. No one's hair grows that fast. Muchami is outraged. He stalks home as though burning the fields in his wake, like Hanuman setting Lanka alight in his tail. He knows he must decide what best to do with this information, and that it might be his obligation to go to Vaidam, who, as his employer and the master of a house on the Brahmin quarter, is most entitled to know and take action. But Muchami is not convinced that Vaidam will do what must be done. He has never shown caste loyalty. If anything, he acts as though it would please him to see the entire Brahmin quarter in ruin. And if he tells Vaidam, and Vaidam does nothing, it will be much more difficult then to redress this ill. He decides to call a conference. He invites Minister and Murthy to come to Sivakami's house after tiffin. He tells Vaidam not to go play tennis. He tells Sivakami only that the others will be coming, not why. He is trembling at the impropriety of it. This is the sort of thing about which he would gossip to Sivakami if it were to have happened several villages away. But so close to home, to the home whose honor it is his dearest duty to uphold. Now Muchami, standing in the door of the garden, tells them what he knows. Murthy begins immediately to splutter and shake. Minister looks circumspect and deeply troubled. How it came about, they wonder but have no idea. Maybe he could have enforced her the first time and has been blackmailing her. Or Shantam, the widow, may have permitted it all along. She's a sullen and feisty type. She and her husband had loud, frequent fights in the years of their marriage, and she has had loud, frequent fights with her in-laws since he died. One of Gayatri's regular jokes is about the fact that this woman's name means peace. What would she have been like if her name had meant hot-tempered? The writer looks exasperated. What concern is this of mine, he asks Michami, and then looks at the others to see what they can answer. Let her bring shame on her own head and her house. No, son. Minister cradles his forehead and his forefinger and thumb. It looks as if someone gave him a gun and he can't decide how to use it. He is the criminal in this situation. A woman's virtue is that of her family, and he has destroyed it, whether or not she chooses each night to open her door. I can't understand. How can you both still be sitting and talking? Murthy has leapt from his chair. Open her door. I'll open his head, that's what. He's running for the door now, his hands over his ears. My ears are poisoned by what I have heard today. He stumbles in an attempt to mount the 2 or 3 steps to his own veranda and succumbs to an attack of asthma, whereupon a few passers-by stop to ask what is wrong. He tells them. That night, Shantam's nearest neighbor's servants are posted in the brush beyond her courtyard gate. The unlucky lover arrives. He pushes open the door, enters, closes it behind him. Each of the servants slips from his hiding place. Each goes to the door of the house he serves and tells his employer that the barber is inside. Each goes to the next house and tells the master of that house. Moments pass, and from each house emerges its master. Each master carries a big stick. What is the barber's second son thinking? He must be about 17, she about twice his age, plump and fair, while he is dark as rosewood. Sivakami thinks of them as she does her beating, working fast, very fast. She hears one of the servants knock on their door to inform Vairam that the moment has come for action. Michami, who is spending the night in the courtyard, tells him Vairam will not come because Vairam has said he will have nothing to do with this nonsense, that mobs always chase phantoms, that he has to work in the morning, unlike these professional moralists in search of a night's entertainment. There are more than enough hands anyway, more than 15 pairs, all holding sticks, heading for the house. Did he force her? Sivakami wonders. But why didn't she just bar the door and not permit him to come again? Could he really have blackmailed her? She would have been defiled and disgraced, but better than going through it night after night, no? Unless she really did choose this. Sivakami can barely bring herself to think it. A barber, one of the worst classes of untouchables, a Brahmin woman choosing to be with a barber. Sivakami casts her mind back to the years of her marriage and remembers vividly still, because barely a night has passed in 40 years when she hasn't thought about the acts of love she and her husband performed with each other. She can't help it. Her mind begins to imagine Shantam, the barber's son, in his poses, and she shudders, disgusted. But her mind keeps picturing it. She tries to keep the bile down and her mind clear by concentrating on the image she's working in beads. Lord Krishna at Bhutana's poisoned breast. It doesn't work. She runs outside and vomits. Kadappan has closed the door, but not drawn the heavy bolt. He never does, why should he? Shantam is waiting for him on the wooden bench in the back of the house where she is made to sleep. She hates sleeping there, but each of the bedrooms is now taken up by one of her late husband's brothers. Each of them is married now, and so they need private rooms. She could sleep in a corner of the main hall with the children, but it's her mother-in-law's prerogative, and she wants Shantam to sleep outside. Shantam makes up for it in small cruelties toward her nephews and nieces, and even sometimes toward her own children. She is sitting waiting for him on the bench. He crosses to her on silent feet. Her sari has already slipped from her head, and now he unwinds it from her shoulders and buries his face in the soft flesh between her collarbone and breast, stroking his lips and eyelids across the pillow of silky, fragrant skin. She's so unlike the women of his class, not that he has had one yet, but he can tell. They stand and walk past the cowshed into the garden, her sari beginning already to unwrap. They pull it after themselves and spread it on the garden floor. And when the enraged men burst into the courtyard and run from there into the garden, this is what they say. The widow trying to wrap herself back into the white sari that has been serving as her illicit conjugal bed, and the glistening form of the barber's second son reaching the top of the garden wall and jumping down off of it. By now, Shantam's mother-in-law and other family members who had not been informed about the raid have flung open numerous internal doors. Some of the men run through the house to the front and start shouting for those doors to be unlocked, while others have already run back out and through the neighbors' houses onto the Brown Porter street to see which way the scoundrel is going. Every woman on the street except Sivakami is witness to the flight of the naked and terrified boy who streaks straight up the Brown Porter, whistled along by the wind and the matron's gasps. The men give chase. They chase him far through bramble and brooks. He's much faster than they, but two send their servants on bicycles to cut him off. He is caught. These weak, pulpy Brahmins, worked up by the chase, beat Kadavan very badly. Muchami helps in the chase, but participates only a little in the beating. Shantam is also chastised and lightly beaten by her mother-in-law in front of her children and all her brothers and sisters-in-law. These are the events of that night. Sivakami hears the men return and go to their homes. Muchami comes back too and tells her what happened. Then he lies down in the courtyard to sleep. She closes the kitchen door, goes into the pantry and closes those doors too. She lies where she normally lies. She's calmer, but can feel the horrible images trying to reform in her mind's eye. She tries to banish them again, and images of her husband, his skin sliding against hers, the smoothness of his back where she gripped it, her fingertips notching his spine slip in with distressing ease to replace those of the barber's son, who is just a few years younger than her husband was when he died. Sivakami doesn't permit herself to move. She lies as every night on her side, on the cool floor of the pantry, her neck on a wooden rest, but shifts her legs minutely against that delicious discomfort which now can never be eased. She had almost managed to forget that gnaw, that tickle, brushed it away with busyness and prayer. The advance of age was a relief. In the last 10 years, the craving has begun to diminish. Now her chest feels thick with anger at Shantam for having reminded her. Shantam has been a widow for less than 10 years, feeling no touch save that of her children, and even that only after sunset, and Shantam's not even permitted to sleep with them. Sivakami recalls her first years of widowhood, when she slept curled around her son, the warm pressure of his milk-smelling, dream-twitching little boy body anchoring her to her own body, which seemed in daylight not to exist at all. Sivakami wraps her arms around herself, biting her lip. She knows what Shantam has endured, but it is their lot to endure. If not, why else does Sivakami live as she does? What appeal is there in a topsy-turvy world, and what place does a widow have, if not this one? At first light, the next morning, a bullock solemnly pulls a cart down the Brahmin Porter from Shantam's house toward Kalithalan. On the cart are two men and a big load of hay from which they are creating a wake, systematically depositing large handfuls behind them on the path and roadway. When this is done, a priest from the Brahmin Porter temple drops 3 lumps of broken camphor at the edge of the straw carpet, which begins where Kadavan landed after vaulting Shantam's wall. 3 palms of flame grow fingers, join hands, and run up the Brahmin Porter. Where the fire hits a pocket of damp, it pops and hisses, much like the good Brahmin folk of the village waiting for the street to be purified so they can meet and rehash the night's events. When the veil of smoke lifts, the carpet of straw has magically changed into one of ash, and the Brahmin Porter too has been magically restored to its former untouchability, which the untouchable robbed by his touch. Shantam disappears the next day, taking with her her jewels, those that should have been her daughters, and 6 silk saris belonging to her sisters-in-law. She is never seen in Chorapati again. From time to time, a rumor floats back. Shantam, seen in Tanjavur, thinner and darker, living with a pearl fisherman selling pearls on the harbor road. Shantam, cheeks and ears pierced by tridents, hair grown matted and coiled atop her half-mad head, running up to pilgrims in the Parini temple and telling their fortunes whether they want them or not. Shantam, fatter and fairer, living in Benares, masquerading as a wealthy Parsi widow, running a charity home for destitute or abandoned Brahmin widows. None of the rumors is ever corroborated. Kadavan, the barber's second son, needs surgery and is taken to the French mission hospital to have it done, but by then he's been bleeding internally for 10 or 12 hours, and so it's too late, and he dies. At the beginning of the following year, the company employing Kadavan's older brother fails. It's a bad time for rubber, for companies generally. He's sent home on a ship that gets caught in a typhoon and founders on some rocks. If there are survivors, he's not among them. His parents have now lost both their sons. They never have grandchildren. Their older son's widow, as is not uncommon in their community, remarries. The elder barber goes back to shaving the heads of all his customers. Perhaps he still says, "I'm sorry," as he did to Sivakami before shaving a Brahmin widow's head for the first first time? Perhaps not.